the year 306 since the Nativity of Christ. Eboracum, a Roman outpost in the frigid north of Britain. In the raw fog that shrouded the banks of the river Ouse like a veil, the rough outlines of fortress walls and legionary barracks were barely visible. The air was not just damp and cold, it was electrified with anticipation. An anticipation mixed with a subconscious, sticky fear. In the imperial palace, the temporary residence of the Augustus of the West, not only the day but a whole life was fading away. The life of Flavius Valerius Constantius, nicknamed Chlorus for the pallor of his skin. The great commander, one of the four pillars upon which the fragile structure of Diocletian's Tetrarchy rested, was dying. No one in that damp British fortress yet knew. No one could even imagine that on this very day, in this place, far from the splendor of eternal Rome, the threads of fate would be woven into such a tight and bloody knot that it would forever change the course of history. That it was here, surrounded by legionaries hardened in battles with the Picts, that a spark would be ignited, from which a flame would rise capable of consuming the old world and erecting a new one on its ashes. A world in which the pagan gods of Olympus would yield to a crucified carpenter from Galilee, and the capital of the world would move from ancient Rome to a new one, bearing the name of the man who now stood at his father's deathbed. At the bedside of the dying emperor stood his son, a young man in his early 30s whose face, as if carved from stone, bore the stamp of extraordinary will and hidden energy. His name was Gaius Flavius Valerius Aurelius Constantinus. He had only recently, after many years of virtual hostage-taking at the court of the senior emperor Galerius in the east, made a daring, almost insane escape across all of Europe to see his father alive. Now his father was dying, and with him was dying the system that was supposed to guarantee the empire's stability. The system of the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four, a brilliant and at the same time monstrous invention of Diocletian's mind, was creaking at the seams. It was designed to prevent civil wars for the throne, but right now, it was poised to spawn the most terrible of them all. A silent question hung in the air, as heavy as a tombstone. What would happen next? According to the system's rules, the death of Constantius Chlorus should have led to a strictly regulated transfer of power. But rules are written for peaceful times, and these were wolfish times. In Rome, a conspiracy was brewing. In the east, the powerful Galerius, who despised both father and son, was hoarding poison and malice. And here in Eboracum, the legions loyal to their commander were already beginning to whisper, their gazes turning more and more to the dying Augustus's son. They saw in him not just an heir, but a new leader, capable of leading them to glory and, more importantly, to rich spoils. At this very moment, history paused, taking a deep breath before plunging into the abyss of change. And at the center of this gathering vortex stood a man whose name, Constantine, would soon thunder throughout the world, becoming a symbol of holiness for some and a sign of a curse for others. A man destined to become great. Before we follow Constantine on his bloody path to soul power, it is necessary to understand the world into which he was born and raised. The 3rd century of our era went down in Roman history as the age of the barracks emperors, a century of almost continuous chaos. The empire seemed mortally ill. In the 50 years from 235 to 284, more than 20 legitimate emperors and countless usurpers succeeded each other on the throne, and almost all of them died violent deaths. Rulers were proclaimed and overthrown by the legions, turning the purple mantle into a death sentence. The empire was torn apart not only by internal enemies. Its borders were cracking under the pressure of barbarian tribes. For example, the Goths crossed the Danube and plundered the Balkans and Asia Minor. The Franks and Alemanni broke through the Rhine into Gaul, and the Sarmatians threatened the Pannonian provinces. In the east, the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire inflicted humiliating defeats on Rome, and in the year 260, Emperor Valerian was captured by the Persian Shah Shapur III, an indelible disgrace for the entire empire. The economy lay in ruins, stricken by rampant inflation. The silver content in the main coin, the denarius, dropped to almost zero, turning it into a copper piece with a thin silver wash. Trade routes, once the safe arteries of the empire, became the prey of robbers and pirates. To all this was added the so-called Plague of Cyprian, a devastating pandemic, probably of smallpox or measles, which at the height of the epidemic claimed up to 5,000 lives a day in Rome. At one point, it seemed that the unified Roman Empire was about to disintegrate into several warring states, as had already happened with the Gallic Empire in the west, which united Gaul, Britain, and Spain under its rule, and the Palmyrene Empire in the east, which subjugated Syria, Egypt, and part of Asia Minor. It was an age of despair when the old gods seemed to have turned their backs on Rome. In these conditions, people sought solace in new, more personal cults, promising salvation that came from the east, such as the mysteries of Mithras, Isis, or the rapidly gaining strength of Christianity. It was from this chaos, as a response to a mortal crisis, that the figure of Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus and his system, the Tetrarchy, were born. The story of our hero begins in the city of Naissus, in the province of Moesia Superior, now the city of Niš in Serbia. Flavius Valerius Constantinus was born here, presumably on February 27th, around the year 272. This land, the Danubian limes, was a harsh frontier, for centuries serving as the forge of Rome's best soldiers. Men here were born with a sword in hand and from a young age were accustomed to the harsh discipline of the legions. His father, Constantius, was just such a man, a scion of the Illyrian military aristocracy who had made a brilliant career in the army under emperors Aurelian and Probus. He was a tough, disciplined man with a reputation as a capable and just commander. Constantine's mother, Helena, however, was a much more mysterious figure and, from the perspective of the Roman aristocracy, entirely common. Later Christian authors, seeking to ennoble the origins of the first Christian emperor's mother, would call her the daughter of a British king, but this is no more than a pious legend. The most reliable sources, including unfriendly ones, state that she was the daughter of an innkeeper, or the proprietress of a roadside inn in Bithynia, in Asia Minor. For a proud Roman officer, a relationship with such a woman could only be a temporary cohabitation or concubinatus, not a legitimate marriage. However, it seems that Constantius genuinely loved Helena, and their union was a strong one. It was this woman, simple and, as it turned out, incredibly strong in spirit, who had an immense influence on her son. Her humble origins, however, became both a stigma for Constantine, which his enemies would use against him, and a stimulus. He would have to prove his whole life that he was worthy of power not only by his father's right, but by his own personal qualities. When in 289 Constantius, climbing the career ladder, was forced for the sake of a political alliance to marry Theodora, the stepdaughter of Emperor Maximian, he divorced Helena. This was a blow to both her and young Constantine. He was sent away from his father and found himself at the court of the most powerful man in the world, Emperor Diocletian, who was then in his eastern capital, Nicaea, which is now the city of Izmit in Turkey. Officially, he was there to receive the best education and prepare for future state service. In fact, he was an honorable hostage, a guarantee of the loyalty of his father, Constantius, who in 293 became Caesar, the junior co-ruler of the West in the new tetrarchic system. The years spent in Nicaea became for Constantine a true university of power, intrigue, and survival. Nicaea under Diocletian was rebuilt into a magnificent capital, intended to outshine Rome. Constantine saw the splendor and power of the imperial court, the meticulously refined ceremony borrowed from Persian kings and designed to inspire awe and emphasize the divine status of the Augusti. He studied the Greek language, which was the language of culture and philosophy in the East, as well as Latin rhetoric. But most importantly, he observed, he saw how the machine of imperial administration worked, how conspiracies were woven, how favorites rose and fell. He served in the army under Diocletian himself and the second Augustus of the East, Galerius, participating in campaigns in Egypt and on the Danube. He proved himself a brave warrior and a talented commander, which earned him popularity among the soldiers. It was here, in Nicaea, that he witnessed the most terrible and bloody event that defined the religious landscape of the era, the great persecution of Christians. To understand the significance of Constantine's subsequent conversion, one must fully grasp what the great persecution, initiated by Diocletian in 303, represented. It was not a spontaneous outburst of hatred. It was a calculated, systematic state policy aimed at the complete eradication of Christianity, which was seen by Diocletian and especially his co-ruler Galerius as the main threat to traditional Roman values and the unity of the empire. The Tetrarchic system, introduced by Diocletian in 293, was a radical attempt to save the state. The empire was divided into two parts, West and East. Each was ruled by a pair of emperors, a senior one, bearing the title of Augustus, and a junior one called Caesar. The Caesar succeeded the Augustus, and a new Caesar was appointed to his place. Thus Diocletian, who was Augustus of the East, and Maximian, who was Augustus of the West, as well as their Caesars Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, were to ensure a stable transfer of power and effective governance of the vast territory. The ideological foundation of the Tetrarchy became the cult of the emperors, equated with gods. Diocletian took the title Eovius from Jupiter, and Maximian the title Herculeus from Hercules. They were not just rulers but earthly incarnations of the supreme gods. Refusal to participate in this cult, to sacrifice to the genius of the emperor, was regarded as high treason. Christians, with their strict monotheism and refusal to worship anyone but their one God, became the main ideological enemies in this system. They created a state within a state. Their communities were cohesive, their bishops possessed enormous authority, and their faith was rapidly spreading through all layers of society, including the army and even the imperial court. Diocletian's wife Prisca and daughter Valeria, according to some reports, sympathized with Christianity. Galerius, a staunch pagan and a coarse soldier, constantly urged Diocletian to eradicate this plague. And so, on February 23, 303, on the day of the Roman festival of Terminalia, the first edict was issued. It ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred books, and the stripping of Christians of all offices and rights. Constantine, who was in Nicaea, saw with his own eyes how soldiers burst into the main Christian church of the city, which stood on a hill directly opposite the imperial palace, plundered it, and razed it to the ground. This was only the beginning. The second edict ordered the arrest of all clergy. The third authorized their torture to force them to renounce their faith. The fourth, most cruel edict of 304 extended the requirement to sacrifice to the gods to all Christians without exception, men, women, and children. Those who refused faced an agonizing death. The empire was plunged into terror. The persecutions were especially fierce in the east. In the domains of Diocletian and Galerius, Christians were crucified, burned over a slow fire, and thrown to wild beasts. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea, a contemporary of the events, left blood-curdling descriptions of these executions. He wrote that some were thrown to wild beasts, and that they saw them not just dragged, but thrown up by machines so that their legs, feet, and joints were shattered. At the same time, in the West, in Gaul and Britain, under the rule of Constantine's father, Constantius Chlorus, the persecutions were much milder. Constantius being a tolerant man and possibly sympathizing with solar monotheism, the cult of the unconquered son, limited himself to destroying a few churches but did not touch the people themselves. This difference in policy between the fathers would become a key factor that would later allow Constantine to position himself as a protector of Christians. Observing all this, Constantine drew his conclusions. He saw not only the cruelty of the persecutions but also their futility. He saw the incredible steadfastness of the martyrs, which aroused not horror but admiration in many pagans. He understood that Christianity was not just a sect, but a powerful, organized force that could not be destroyed by violence. Perhaps it was then that the thought was born in his pragmatic mind that this force could be used, not destroyed. In 305, an event unheard of in Roman history occurred. Diocletian, tired of power and suffering from illness, voluntarily abdicated in Nicaea and forced his co-ruler Maximian to do the same in Milan. Power passed to their Caesars. Galerius became Augustus of the East, and Constantius Chlorus became Augustus of the West, by the logic of the system and universal expectation. Constantine and Maxentius, Maximian's son, should have become the new Caesars. Everyone expected this, but Galerius, who hated and feared Constantine because of his popularity and abilities, insisted on his own choice. His protégés were appointed as the new Caesars, Flavius Severus in the west and Maximinus Daia in the east, his own nephew. For Constantine, this was not just a humiliation, it was a mortal threat. He remained at Galerius's court as a hostage, and his life hung by a thread. His father, Constantius, far away in Gaul, sent letters to Galerius requesting that his son be released to him, citing his poor health and the need for assistance in the upcoming campaign in Britain. Galerius long refused, but finally, under pressure of circumstances and perhaps not wanting an open break with Constantius, he reluctantly gave permission. Legend has it that Galerius signed the travel warrant in the evening, intending to cancel his order in the morning or send a pursuit after Constantine. But Constantine was not so simple. Upon receiving permission, he fled that very night. He raced westward along the main imperial roads using the system of state post stations. At each station, he exchanged tired horses for fresh ones and maimed the others by cutting their hamstrings so that he could not be pursued. It was a desperate dash for freedom and power across all of Europe. He made it. He found his father in Bononia, which is now Bologna, just before his departure on an expedition against the Picts and Scots in Britain. The father and son, separated for many years, were finally reunited. Together they crossed the Channel and conducted a successful military campaign in the north of the island, reaching the Antonine Wall. But Constantius's health was failing. On July 25, 306, he died in Eboracum. Before his death, according to sources loyal to Constantine, Constantius proclaimed his son as his sole heir to the title of Augustus. But even if this were true, under the laws of the Tetrarchy, it had no force. Power was to pass to Caesar Severus. However, the legions stationed in Britain, including the famous 6th Victrix Legion, had their own opinion. The soldiers, whom Constantius had generously rewarded and who admired the courage and generosity of his son, did not want a distant and unknown Severus as their ruler. Immediately after Constantius's death, at the initiative of a German chieftain in Roman service, the Alemannic king Crocus, they proclaimed Constantine as Augustus and raised him on their shields, clothing him in the imperial purple. This was an act of high treason, a direct challenge to the tetrarchic system and to the most powerful man in the empire, Galerius. Civil war became inevitable. Constantine, however, showed not only audacity but also a cunning surprising for a young usurper. He sent his laureled portrait to Galerius, but not as an Augustus, as if asking for recognition. He accompanied it with a letter in which he regretted that the fervent troops had forced the highest title upon him and asked to be recognized at least with the rank of Caesar in place of his deceased father. Galerius was furious. He wanted to burn both the portrait and the messenger. but his advisors dissuaded him, pointing out that an open war with Constantine, who was popular with the troops, was dangerous. Gritting his teeth, Galerius compromised. He recognized the legitimate heir Severus as Augustus of the West and granted Constantine the title of Caesar. Constantine agreed for a time. He had gained legitimacy, time, and a foothold for the future struggle. The chaos of the Tetrarchy was just beginning. The imperial purple, once a symbol of unshakable power and divine order, had in these years become a death trap. Diocletian's system, designed to put an end to usurpers, had spawned them in unprecedented numbers. Anyone with legions and ambition could now aspire to supreme power. Rome, the ancient heart of the empire, felt humiliated. It was no longer the capital, as the emperors ruled from Trier, Milan, and Nicaea, but not from the eternal city. The Praetorian Guard, which had once made and unmade emperors, was stripped of its privileges. Even worse, Galerius intended to impose a poll tax and land tax on the inhabitants of Rome, hitherto free from direct taxation like ordinary provincials. This humiliation could not last forever, and while Constantine was consolidating his power in Gaul, fighting the Franks on the Rhine and earning a reputation as a just ruler, his main rival was preparing to take the stage in Rome. On October 28, 306, just 3 months after Constantine was proclaimed emperor, a revolt broke out in Rome. The disgruntled Praetorians, conspiring with the Roman nobility over the tax policy, proclaimed Maxentius, the son of the old forcibly retired emperor Maximian Herculius, as emperor. Maxentius was the complete opposite of Constantine. Ancient authors describe him as effeminate, cruel, and prone to luxury and tyranny, but he nevertheless skillfully played on the feelings of the Romans, promising to restore the city's former greatness. His rule in Rome and Italy was remembered not only for the abolition of Galerius's hated taxes, but also for growing tyranny. Christian authors accused him of debauchery and of abducting senators' wives, while pagan ones accused him of superstition and excessive cruelty. He launched a large-scale building program in Rome, erecting the grandiose Basilica of Maxentius and a huge circus, but financed this through confiscations and forced levies, which turned both the nobility and the common people against him. Thus, by the year 312, he appeared in the eyes of many not as the savior of Rome, but as its oppressor, giving Constantine a perfect moral justification for invasion. Galerius ordered the legitimate Augustus Severus to suppress the rebellion. Severus marched on Rome with a large army, but here he met with failure. Many of his soldiers had previously served under Maxentius's father, Maximian. To strengthen his son's position, the old Emperor Maximian once again donned the purple. Bribed by the usurper's agents and unwilling to fight against their old commander, Severus's troops defected to the rebels. Severus fled to the impregnable Ravenna, where he was besieged and, believing Maximian's false promises to spare his life, surrendered. He was brought to Rome as a prisoner and soon forced to commit suicide. The death of a legitimate Augustus was a crushing blow to Galerius's authority. Now Galerius himself took the stage. In 307, he personally led a huge army into Italy to avenge Severus and crush Maxentius. But he too met with failure. Maxentius, having fortified Rome and using scorched earth tactics, avoided a decisive battle. Galerius's soldiers, deprived of supplies and tempted by generous promises, began to desert. Fearing to repeat Severus's fate, Galerius was forced to make a disgraceful retreat from Italy. In this complicated game, Constantine behaved with utmost caution. While Galerius and Maxentius weakened each other, he strengthened his Rhine frontier, built cities. It was then that the foundations of future Trier as a magnificent imperial residence were laid, and built a reputation as a protector of the provinces. Maxentius, seeking allies, offered Constantine the hand of his sister Fausta and the title of Augustus. Constantine agreed, This dynastic marriage strengthened his legitimacy. In 307, a lavish wedding took place in Trier, attended by the old Maximian. Constantine officially became the son-in-law of the Herculean imperial family. However, this alliance was doomed, the old intriguer Maximian, having quarreled with his own son over power, fled to Constantine's court in Gaul. In 310, taking advantage of his son-in-law's absence, who was campaigning against the Franks, the old man attempted to start a rebellion in Arelate, which is now the city of Arles, and seize the treasury. But Constantine, showing incredible speed, returned by forced march, trapped his father-in-law in Massilia, modern Marseille, and forced him to surrender. Shortly thereafter, Maximian committed suicide or was killed by Constantine's order. Thus Constantine got rid of a dangerous and unpredictable relative. The death of Galerius from a terrible disease in 311 finally destroyed the tetrarchic system. Before his death, Galerius, tormented by terrible suffering, which Christians considered God's punishment, issued an edict of toleration, ending the great persecution. The empire was now divided among the 4 remaining rulers: Constantine in the west, who controlled Gaul, Britain, and Spain; Maxentius in Italy and Africa; Licinius in the Balkans, who had been proclaimed Augustus in 308 at a special congress in Carnuntum to replace the deceased Severus; and Maximinus Dacia in the east, ruling in Syria and Egypt. The fragile balance could not last long, and Constantine decided to strike first. In 312, under the pretext of liberating Rome from Maxentius's tyranny, Constantine began his famous Italian campaign. It was pure adventure. Maxentius had a much larger army at his disposal, about 100,000 men, including the Praetorian Guard and elite Moorish detachments. He controlled the well-fortified cities of northern Italy and the impregnable Rome. Constantine had about 40,000 veterans hardened in battles on the Rhine, but this was clearly not enough for such a campaign. However, he was banking on speed, surprise, and the high morale of his troops. Crossing the Alps via the Mont Cenis Pass, he swiftly invaded Italy. The first serious obstacle was the strongly fortified Segusio, modern Susa. The gates were locked, the walls full of defenders. Constantine ordered the gates to be set on fire and was the first to rush the assault. The city fell. Moving on, he approached Turin, where he encountered Maxentius's heavy cavalry, Clibanarii, clad in bronze armor along with their horses. Constantine used a cunning tactic. His infantrymen, armed with heavy clubs with iron heads, dived under the horses, striking not at the riders but at their mounts, and disrupted the ranks of the armored cavalry. The victory at Turin opened the way to Milan. The bloodiest battle of this campaign took place near Verona. Here, one of Maxentius's best commanders, Ruricius Pompeianus, had taken up position. Verona was surrounded by the Adige River, making it almost impregnable. Constantine besieged the city while Pompeianus managed to break out, raise a new army, and strike the besiegers from the rear. Constantine was caught between 2 fires. Displaying miracles of tactical genius, he divided his army, leaving a part to continue the siege, and with his best forces turned and attacked Pompeianus's army. The battle was incredibly fierce and lasted all night. Constantine personally fought in the front ranks, inspiring his soldiers. By morning, Pompeianus's army was defeated and he himself fell in battle. Verona surrendered. The road to Rome was open. Maxentius, who had been sitting in the capital until then, made a fatal mistake. Instead of continuing to use the advantage of Rome's impregnable walls and waiting for Constantine's army to exhaust itself in a siege, he, influenced by unfavorable omens and the grumbling of the Romans who accused him of cowardice, decided to give a general battle. He led his troops out of the city and across the Tiber via a pontoon bridge he had built next to the old Milvian bridge. He was absolutely confident of victory. But the day before this battle, on October 27th, 312, an event occurred that would forever change not only Constantine's fate, but that of the entire Western world. The world stood on the threshold of the greatest religious revolution. But this revolution needed its earthly leader, a sword to clear its path. And so, on the banks of the Tiber, where two Roman armies were about to clash, it was not just two claimants to the throne who met. Two eras met. The old pagan Rome, which relied on divination by animal entrails and the will of capricious Olympian gods, and the nascent Christian world, which drew its strength from faith in one almighty God. And at that very moment, as Christian historians claim, the heavens gave a sign intended for one man on whose decision the fates of millions depended. There are two main versions of what exactly happened on the eve of the battle, both coming from people in Constantine's inner circle. The first belongs to the rhetorician Lactantius, who wrote his work on the deaths of the persecutors just a few years after the events. He reports that in a dream at night, Constantine was commanded to inscribe the celestial sign of God on his soldiers' shields and then to enter battle. The second, later and much more famous version belongs to Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, who wrote the life of Constantine after the emperor's death. Eusebius claims to have heard this story from Constantine himself, confirmed by an oath. According to this account, during the march on Rome during the day, Constantine and his entire army saw in the sky above the sun a sign of the cross composed of light, and next to it an inscription in Greek, which in Latin reads, "In hoc signo vinces," and in English, "In this sign conquer." This vision astounded him, and the following night Christ himself appeared to him in a dream, commanding him to make a military standard similar to the one seen in the sky, and to use it as a defense in battles. This standard was called the labarum. It consisted of a long spear with a crossbar from which hung a piece of silk cloth. At the top of the spear was the monogram of Christ's name, consisting of the two Greek letters chi and rho, superimposed on each other. What was it really? A miracle? A hallucination of a tired commander? An atmospheric phenomenon, such as a parhelion or a solar halo, which a pragmatic commander interpreted to his advantage? Or a subtle psychological and political calculation? Historians debate this to this day. Skeptics point out that Constantine continued to use pagan symbolism until the end of his life, particularly that of his personal patron, the unconquered sun. The Chi-Rho monogram could also be understood as an abbreviation of the Greek word kreston, meaning good or auspicious. Perhaps it was a brilliant move. For the Christian soldiers, and there were already many in the army, this was the sign of Christ, and for the pagans simply a good omen. But whatever the case, Constantine had made his choice. He staked everything, his life and his empire, linking his fate with the God of the Christians. On October 28, 312, the armies clashed at the Milvian bridge. Maxentius's army occupied a disadvantageous position, being pressed against the Tiber River. Constantine, whose warriors were inspired by the new standard and faith in divine aid, unleashed the full might of his battle-hardened cavalry and infantry on the enemy. The battle was stubborn, but soon Maxentius's troops wavered and began a disorderly retreat towards the pontoon bridge they themselves had built. In a terrible crush, the bridge could not hold and collapsed, dragging hundreds of soldiers into the murky waters of the Tiber. Maxentius himself, trying to escape, also drowned in the river. The next day his body was found. His head was cut off and carried through the streets of Rome on a spear as irrefutable proof of Constantine's victory and the tyrant's demise. Constantine entered Rome as a triumphator. The Senate hastened to declare him the senior Augustus. In honor of his victory, the famous Arch of Constantine was erected, which still stands today. It is noteworthy that it bears no explicit Christian symbols, but has an inscription stating that the victory was won by the inspiration of the divinity. This ambiguous wording perfectly reflects Constantine's own policy at that time. He disbanded the Praetorian Guard, forever depriving it of political influence. He became the undisputed master of the West, but in the East, he still had rivals. The drama of the Tetrarchy was not yet over. The victory at the Milvian Bridge made Constantine the master of the western half of the Roman world. In the East, after the death of Maximinus Daia in 313, who was defeated by Licinius, all power was concentrated in the hands of Licinius. For a short time, a duumvirate was established in the empire. The two emperors, Constantine and Licinius, sealed their alliance with a marriage. Licinius married Constantine's sister, Constantia. It seemed that peace had come, but two such ambitious and power-hungry natures were too cramped in one empire. Two suns cannot shine in the same sky at the same time. So their alliance was merely a temporary respite before the final, decisive struggle for sole rule over the entire Roman world. And the battlefield in this struggle would be not only the fields of Thrace and the waves of the Hellespont, but also the minds of men. For now it was a conflict not just of two emperors, but of two worldviews. In February of 313, Constantine and Licinius met in Mediolanum, modern Milan, to discuss the future of the empire. The result of this meeting was a document that went down in history as the Edict of Milan. Contrary to a common misconception, this edict did not make Christianity the state religion. It did something else, but no less revolutionary. It proclaimed complete freedom of religion for all inhabitants of the empire. The text of the edict, which has come down to us through Lactantius and Eusebius, states that it was decided to grant both to the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever religion each person has preferred. That the divinity who sits in heaven may be propitious and kindly disposed to us and to all who are placed under our rule, the edict not only ended persecutions but also ordered the return of all confiscated property to the Christians, that is, churches, lands, cemeteries, even if it had already been sold to private individuals. This was a document of incredible political wisdom. Constantine understood that simply banning paganism, the religion of the vast majority of the population and the entire old aristocracy, was impossible and dangerous. Instead, he placed Christianity on an equal footing with other cults, but at the same time he clearly singled it out. He spoke of the supreme divinity in the singular, which could be understood by both pagan philosophers who leaned towards monotheism and by Christians. He secured the loyalty of the most active, cohesive, and rapidly growing part of society. The Christian Church, receiving official recognition and patronage for the first time, became a most powerful pillar of his rule. However, the alliance with Licinius was fragile. As early as 316, the first war broke out between them. Constantine accused Licinius of conspiracy. Two bloody battles took place at Cybalae in Pannonia and on the Mardian plain in Thrace. Constantine was victorious in both but could not completely crush his opponent. A peace was concluded by which Licinius ceded all his European domains to Constantine, except for Thrace. A fragile truce was established for the next few years. During these years, Constantine actively engaged in strengthening his part of the empire. He conducted successful campaigns against the Goths and Sarmatians on the Danube, securing the borders. He began a large-scale legal reform, issuing laws that already showed the influence of Christian morality. Decrees were issued against the branding of criminals on the face, since it is fashioned in the likeness of celestial beauty, as well as laws making divorce more difficult and laws aimed at protecting slaves and children. In 321, he issued the famous edict recognizing Sunday, or the Venerable Day of the Sun, as an official day of rest for the entire empire. Again, the wording was brilliantly ambiguous, for to Christians this was the Lord's Day, and for pagans the day of their God, the unconquered sun whose cult Constantine continued to support. Meanwhile, Licinius in the east looked with increasing suspicion at the growing popularity of Christianity and its connection with Constantine. He saw Christians as a fifth column of his rival. Gradually, he began to deviate from the principles of the Edict of Milan. First, he forbade Christians from holding positions in the state apparatus. Then he banned church councils, and then he moved on to local persecutions, executions of bishops, and the destruction of churches. Conflict was becoming inevitable. Constantine had a perfect pretext for a new war, as he now acted not just as a usurper striving for absolute power, but as a defender of a persecuted faith. In 324, the second and final war between Constantine and Licinius began. Constantine assembled an army of about 130,000 men and a fleet of 200 ships. Licinius's forces were even larger, about 165,000 soldiers and 350 ships. It was a clash of titans. On July 3, 324, a decisive land battle took place near the city of Adrianople in Thrace. Licinius's army occupied a strong position on a hill behind a river. Constantine, again showing tactical ingenuity, secretly crossed the river with a small detachment at an unexpected point and struck the enemy's flank, causing panic. Simultaneously, his main forces under the banner of the Labarum forced the river and attacked head-on. The battle was incredibly bloody. Sources speak of tens of thousands dead. Licinius's army was utterly routed, and he himself fled to the protection of the walls of the powerful fortress of Byzantium. Now the outcome of the war was decided at sea. Constantine's fleet, under the command of his eldest son Crispus, a talented young commander, clashed with Licinius's much larger fleet in the Hellespont Strait, now known as the Dardanelles. In a 2-day naval battle, Crispus, using the maneuverability of his smaller and lighter ships, Liburnae, inflicted a crushing defeat on the enemy's cumbersome fleet. Licinius, deprived of support from the sea, was forced to flee from Byzantium to Asia Minor. The final battle took place on September 18, 324 at Chrysopolis, on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus. Constantine ferried his army across the strait and once again defeated the remnants of Licinius's troops. Licinius fled to Nicaea, where he soon surrendered to the mercy of the victor, believing the entreaties of his wife Constantia, Constantine's sister, that his life would be spared. Constantine at first indeed exiled him to Thessalonica, but a few months later, accusing him of a new conspiracy, ordered him to be executed. Now, after almost 2 decades of continuous civil wars, only one emperor remained in the Roman Empire. Constantine had reached the pinnacle of power. He had become the sole ruler of the entire Roman world from Britain to Egypt, and he immediately began 2 projects that were to symbolize the advent of a new era: the convening of the First Ecumenical Council and the founding of a new capital. The site for the new capital was chosen with brilliant foresight. It was the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, located on a strategically vital peninsula at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the sea route from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Constantine appreciated its incredible defensive and commercial advantages. This city was not associated with the pagan past and the senatorial opposition of old Rome. It was to be his city, a new Rome, free from the blood and idols of the past. On November 8, 324, the solemn ceremony of the city's foundation took place. Thousands of workers, soldiers, and artisans were brought from all over the empire. To adorn the new capital, Constantine did not hesitate to plunder the old centers of Hellenic culture, such as Athens, Delphi, and Ephesus. Statues, columns, and works of art were brought from there. The city was built on an unprecedented scale. A hippodrome, forums, palaces, aqueducts, and of course many Christian churches were erected. On May 11, 330, the official consecration of the city took place, which received the name Constantinople, meaning the city of Constantine. It was destined to be the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire for 1,000 years, the greatest and richest city in the Christian world. Having won on the battlefields, Constantine faced an enemy far more insidious and elusive, the division within the Christian Church itself, which he had chosen as his pillar. He sought unity in the empire, but found that Christians, united in their faith in Christ, were engaged in fierce disputes about his nature. From Alexandria, the intellectual center of the East, the teachings of the presbyter Arius were spreading throughout the empire, threatening to tear the church apart from within. The battle for sole power had been won, but now the battle for a single faith was beginning, and the emperor, who only yesterday had been a pagan, took on the unheard-of role of arbiter in the most subtle theological disputes. The Arian controversy, which may seem like abstract scholasticism to a modern person, was of colossal importance to the people of the 4th century. The question was, who was Jesus Christ? Arius, a logician and ascetic, taught that the Son, that is, Christ, is not equal to the Father, that is, God. He is the highest creation of God, perfect but still created, and therefore there was a time when he was not. The Son, according to Arius, is not consubstantial, but of a similar substance to the Father. That is, he is a mediator between God and the world, but not God himself. This teaching was fiercely opposed by the bishop, and later Archbishop of Alexandria, Alexander, and his young, energetic deacon, Athanasius. They argued that the Son is co-eternal and consubstantial, in Greek homoousios, with the Father. That is, Christ is not a creation, but God to the same extent as the Father, of one essence with him. To accept Arius's teaching, in their view, meant to destroy the very foundation of Christianity, the doctrine of the Incarnation and salvation. If Christ is not true God, then his sacrifice on the cross has no redemptive power for all humanity. The dispute quickly spread beyond Alexandria. Bishops from Syria, Palestine, and Asia Minor became involved. The church was on the verge of schism. For Constantine, who saw a unified church as a tool for unifying the empire, such a situation was intolerable. He wrote letters to Arius and Alexander urging them to cease disputes over insignificant matters. But this did not help. Then he made an unprecedented decision, to convene a council of all the bishops of the empire at state expense, so that they could resolve this dispute once and for all. In May of 325, the First Ecumenical Council opened in the city of Nicaea, not far from Constantinople. Between 250 and 318 bishops, mostly from the eastern provinces, gathered there. It was an incredible spectacle. Many of these bishops had only recently been hiding from persecution, bearing on their bodies the scars and marks of torture, such as gouged out eyes and severed tendons. And now they sat as honored guests in the imperial palace, and the emperor of the Romans himself served them. Constantine opened the council with a speech in Latin, which was immediately translated into Greek, in which he called internal strife in the church more terrible than any war or battle, and implored the fathers of the council to reach an agreement. He was not a theologian and probably did not fully understand all the subtleties of the dispute. But he was a brilliant politician. He presided over the sessions, listened to both sides, but ultimately his goal was the adoption of a single formula of faith that the majority would sign. The vast majority of bishops rejected Arius's teaching. The key moment was the adoption of the term homoousios, meaning consubstantial, on which Athanasius's party insisted and which the emperor supported. On the basis of this term, the Nicene Creed was developed, a brief statement of the main dogmas of Christianity which, with some additions, is used in most Christian churches today. It stated that the Son is begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. Arius and a few of his closest supporters refused to sign this creed and were sent into exile. Their teaching was condemned as heresy. It seemed that the victory was complete. Constantine had achieved his goal, apparent unity. However, in reality, the Council of Nicaea did not end, but only began the Arian controversies which would plague the Church for more than half a century. Constantine himself, in the last years of his life, under the influence of his entourage, including his own sister Constantia, would soften his stance towards the Arians and even recall Arius from exile. But a precedent had been set. From now on, the emperor considered it his right to interfere in church affairs, and the church in turn became increasingly dependent on the emperor's will. The alliance of throne and altar, which determined the fate of Byzantium and all of medieval Europe, was sealed. At the pinnacle of his power, having achieved everything a mortal could dream of, becoming the sole ruler of the world and the patron of a new, victorious religion, Constantine faced an enemy against whom neither legions nor omens could save him. This enemy lurked in his own house, in his own family. The year 326, following the triumphant Council of Nicaea, became a year of personal tragedy for the emperor. Dark and mysterious, the sun of his glory was momentarily eclipsed, stained by the blood of his closest kin. The drama that unfolded in the imperial family remains one of the darkest enigmas of his reign. Crispus was Constantine's eldest son, born to his first wife or concubine, Minervina. He was the complete opposite of the effeminate sons from Fausta. Crispus grew up a true warrior, a copy of his father in his youth. He was a talented military commander, as he had proven in campaigns on the Rhine and in the brilliant naval victory over Licinius's fleet. He enjoyed immense popularity in the army and among the people. Constantine had given him the title of Caesar and seemed to be grooming him as his successor. Fausta, Constantine's second wife, the daughter of Maximian and sister of Maxentius, was a powerful and ambitious woman. She had borne Constantine 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, and 2 daughters. She saw in Crispus, a stepson of common birth, the main threat to the future of her own children. In 326, while Constantine was celebrating the 20th anniversary of his reign, disaster struck. During the court's stay in Pola, in Istria, Crispus was suddenly arrested by his father's order, convicted on an unspecified charge and executed. Shortly thereafter, Empress Fausta was also killed. According to the most common version, she was locked in an overheated bath, where she suffocated. What happened? Ancient sources give contradictory accounts. The pagan historian Zosimus, writing much later and hating Constantine as a destroyer of old traditions, presents a version resembling a Greek tragedy. Allegedly, Fausta developed a criminal passion for her stepson Crispus. Being rejected, she, out of revenge, slandered him to Constantine, accusing him of attempted rape. The irascible emperor, in a fit of rage, ordered his son's execution. However, soon Constantine's mother, Saint Helena, who was very fond of her grandson, revealed the truth about the slander to the emperor. Realizing his monstrous mistake, Constantine, mad with grief, ordered Fausta's execution as well. Other historians suggest that the issue was not adultery but politics. Perhaps Fausta, fearing for her son's future, fabricated evidence of a conspiracy by Crispus against his father. Crispus's popularity in the army could have made such an accusation plausible in the eyes of the suspicious emperor. There is also a version that Crispus might indeed have been involved in some intrigue against his father, or that serious disagreements had arisen between them about the future of the empire. The truth is forever hidden under a veil of mystery. Constantine ordered the memory of Crispus and Fausta to be damned. Their names were erased from inscriptions, their images destroyed. The topic became taboo, but the shadow of this family tragedy lay over the last years of the emperor's reign. Some historians link his mother Helena's famous pilgrimage to the Holy Land with remorse for this double murder. After the tragedy of 326, the Augusta Helena, who was already nearly 80 years old, embarked on a long and difficult journey to Palestine. Officially, it was a pious pilgrimage to the holy sites associated with Christ's earthly life, but many also saw it as an act of penance for her son's sins. Arriving in Jerusalem, which after its destruction by the Romans in the 1st century had been rebuilt as the pagan city of Aelia Capitolina, Helena launched a flurry of activity. By her order and with funds from the imperial treasury, excavations were begun at sites that the local Christian community revered as Golgotha, the place of crucifixion, and the Holy Sepulchre, the place of burial and resurrection. According to legend, a pagan temple of Venus, built under Emperor Hadrian, stood on the site of the Holy Sepulchre. Helena ordered the temple to be demolished. It was during these excavations, as church tradition holds, that the greatest event occurred, the discovery of the true cross of the Lord. The legend tells that 3 crosses were found, Christ's and those of the 2 thieves, as well as the titulus with the inscription, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, and the nails. To determine which of the crosses was authentic, the Bishop of Jerusalem, Macarius, proposed to lay them one by one on a seriously ill woman. The touch of 2 crosses had no effect, but as soon as the 3rd touched her, she was healed. According to another version, the cross resurrected a deceased person being carried by. A piece of this cross Helena sent to her son in Constantinople, and left the remaining part in Jerusalem, where, by her and Constantine's order, the Grand Church of the Holy Sepulchre was founded. Helena also founded churches in Bethlehem at the site of Christ's Nativity and on the Mount of Olives at the site of the Ascension. Her pilgrimage and building activities transformed Palestine from a backwater province into the main center of the Christian world, to which pilgrims would flock for centuries. Helena herself, after her death, was canonized and is revered as a saint, equal to the apostles. The authenticity of the discovery of the cross is a matter of faith, not historical science. Many modern historians consider this story a later pious legend. However, it is impossible to deny the colossal influence that this story and the relics brought by Helena had on the entire Christian world, giving rise to the cult of the cross and holy relics, which became one of the most important features of medieval Christianity. Having accomplished all that seemed possible and even more, having redrawn the map of the world, its faith, and its laws, Constantine approached his final frontier. His empire, united by iron and faith, stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Arabia. His new capital shone on the Bosphorus, eclipsing old Rome. But even the great cannot escape their fate. In the last years of his life, his gaze was turned to the east, to the ancient enemy of Rome, the Sasanian Persian Empire. He was preparing a grand campaign, dreaming perhaps of repeating or even surpassing the glory of Alexander the Great. But it was on the threshold of this last war that illness struck him. The sunset of the great emperor's life was as symbolic as his entire destiny, for it occurred in the east, from where his new faith had come, and to where the center of his new empire had shifted. The last decade of Constantine's reign was a time of large-scale reforms designed to consolidate the new order he had created. In the military sphere, he completed the process of dividing the army into 2 parts. Begun under Diocletian, mobile field armies, or comitatenses, were created, consisting of the best elite units and under the direct command of the emperor. They were to serve as a strike force capable of moving quickly to any point in the empire to repel a major invasion or suppress a rebellion. On the borders, however, served the border troops, or limitanei, consisting of less combat-effective but more numerous units, who were often also peasant militiamen who had received land in exchange for service. The strategic logic of this reform was twofold. Firstly, the limitanae served as a kind of tripwire, a first line of defense that was supposed to contain minor raids and slow down a major invasion until the main army arrived. Secondly, and no less importantly, concentrating elite troops in the comitatenses under the emperor's personal control reduced the risk of usurpation of power by provincial governors and commanders, which had been the scourge of the 3rd century. This system, although criticized by some for weakening border defenses, proved to be quite effective and existed in one form or another for several centuries. In the administrative sphere, he definitively separated civil and military power, which was intended to reduce the risk of usurpation by military leaders. A complex hierarchy of civil officials was created, headed by praetorian prefects. The entire empire was divided into several large prefectures, which in turn were divided into dioceses, and dioceses into provinces. This cumbersome bureaucratic system would become one of the characteristic features of the late Roman and Byzantine empires. In the financial sphere, his main achievement was the introduction of a new gold coin, the solidus. Unlike the constantly debased and devalued silver and bronze coins, the solidus maintained its purity and weight for almost 7 centuries, becoming a kind of dollar of antiquity in the Middle Ages. This stabilized the economy, but at the same time placed a heavy tax burden on the population, as taxes now had to be paid in gold. This created a dual economy. State finances, the army, and large-scale trade operated with stable gold, while the daily life of ordinary people, especially in the countryside, continued to depend on debased copper currency. For small landowners and artisans, the need to pay taxes in solidi, which were difficult to obtain, often meant ruin and debt bondage. The most controversial and debated reforms concerned his religious policy. Was Constantine a genuine Christian or a cynical pragmatist who used the church for his own ends? This question will probably never receive a definitive answer. On the one hand, he generously endowed the church with lands and privileges, exempted the clergy from taxes, and built magnificent churches. His legislation bore the imprint of Christian morality. On the other hand, until the end of his life, he bore the pagan title of Pontifex Maximus. His coins continued to feature pagan gods, especially the unconquered sun, and he did not shy away from cruelty and treachery when it came to consolidating his power. Probably the truth lies somewhere in between. His personal faith was most likely syncretic, mixing Christian ideas with elements of solar monotheism and traditional Roman notions of divine patronage. He saw in the Christian God the most powerful of all gods, who had granted him victory and power. He supported the church not only out of political calculation, but also out of a sincere belief in its divine power. But at the same time, he remained a Roman emperor, for whom the highest value was the unity and well-being of the state, and he was ready to use any means to achieve this goal. In 337, while preparing for a campaign against the Persian king Shapur II, who had begun to persecute Christians in his domains, Constantine fell ill. He went to the city of Helenopolis in Bithynia to use the local thermal waters, but he did not get better. Feeling death approaching, he decided to be baptized. The fact that he postponed baptism until his deathbed should not be surprising. In the 4th century, this was a common practice. It was believed that the sacrament of baptism washed away all sins committed by a person up to that point. Therefore, many, especially people whose lives were associated with violence and complex political decisions, like the emperor, preferred to be baptized as late as possible to appear before God completely purified. He summoned several bishops and asked them to perform the sacrament over him. It is noteworthy that he was baptized by Eusebius of Nicaea, one of the leaders of the Arian party whom Constantine had previously exiled and then recalled to court. Thus, by an irony of fate, the great patron of the Council of Nicaea and defender of consubstantiality was baptized by an Arian heretic. After baptism, he removed the imperial purple and dressed in the white robes of a neophyte, in which he remained until his death. He died at noon on the day of Pentecost, May 22, 337, at the imperial villa of Acheron near Nicaea. His body was transported to Constantinople and, with unprecedented pomp, buried in a sarcophagus in the center of the mausoleum at the Church of the 12 Apostles. He was placed surrounded by 12 cenotaphs, or symbolic tombs of the apostles, thus, as it were, placing himself in their number. Later, the Eastern Church would give him the title equal to the apostles and number him among the saints. His death immediately led to a new bloody slaughter. His sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans divided the empire among themselves, but before that they arranged a massacre, eliminating almost all their male relatives who could have claimed the throne. The peace and unity to which Constantine had dedicated his entire life proved fragile and short-lived. So who was Constantine the Great? The answer depends on whom you ask. For Christian historians like Eusebius, he was God's chosen one, a new Moses who led the people of God out of the slavery of persecution and granted the church peace and prosperity. He was a saint, the 13th apostle, whose reign was a direct intervention of providence in human history. For his pagan opponents, like the historian Zosimus, he was a bloody tyrant, an oath-breaker, the murderer of his own son and wife. He was an apostate who betrayed the ancient gods who had protected Rome for 1,000 years, thereby bringing the wrath of heaven upon the empire and causing its subsequent decline and fall. For thinkers of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, such as Edward Gibbon, he was primarily a brilliant but ruthless and cynical politician. A man who recognized the power of Christianity as a unifying ideology and masterfully used it to achieve and maintain absolute power. Modern historical science, avoiding extreme assessments, sees in him a complex, contradictory, and truly titanic figure, standing at the greatest fault line of eras. He was a product of his cruel time, the time of the barracks emperors, and he acted by its methods, that is, treachery, violence, and cunning. But at the same time, he possessed an incredible historical intuition that allowed him to see the future. He understood that the old pagan world was dying and that a new force, namely Christianity, was coming to replace it, and he did not fight against this current like his predecessors, but tried to lead it and direct it in a course he needed. His legacy is colossal and multifaceted. He ended the persecutions of Christians and turned a persecuted sect into the most influential force in the empire. This step determined the entire subsequent history of Europe and the world. He founded Constantinople, the new Rome, which for 1,000 years became the center of Eastern Christian civilization and a shield for Europe against Eastern invasions. He laid the foundations of the Byzantine model of symphony, or the union of secular and spiritual power, which became a model for many states of the Middle Ages, including Kievan Rus. He was not a saint in the hagiographical sense of the word. He was a man of flesh and blood with his passions, sins, and tragedies. He was a cruel warrior, a cunning politician, and perhaps the murderer of his own kin. But he was also a reformer, a builder, a man who possessed a vision of the future. He halted the disintegration of the Roman Empire, giving it several more centuries of life in a new, Christian form. Constantine the Great will forever remain a figure standing at the crossroads of two worlds, the ancient and the medieval, the pagan and the Christian. He did not just observe the change of eras. He was its chief architect, its midwife, and its first master. And the echo of his deeds, committed in the distant 4th century, still resounds through the corridors of history, shaping the world in which we live today.